Welcome, everyone. This is the live virtual roundtable event where we'll discuss proven strategies at scale for successful DEI programs. I'm your moderator, Douglas Brown, CEO at Halo Consulting, a certified minority-owned search firm based in Chicago. We bring the process-oriented best practices our team developed at top executive search firms with a risk-free, cost-effective fee model tailored for early-stage and high-growth startups for their most critical hires. Halo hosts monthly virtual roundtable events like this one for HR and technology leaders on a variety of topics, and we look forward to seeing you at our future Halo events. This event is being recorded, and feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A function, and we'll address those questions throughout the session. Early next week, we will be sharing a survey to gather your feedback, and we will post a recorded version of this event to YouTube. Today, we are joined by a passionate group of DEI leaders. We want this to be an interactive session, so please ask questions, and let's start off by dropping in the chat where everyone's tuning in from. First, I'd like to introduce Ryan Brown. Ryan leads Science 37's Diversity and Clinical Trials business unit and serves as a strategic advisor to the industry's first Diversity and Clinical Trials Foundation. Ryan brings more than a decade of clinical research experience from PRA, PPD, and worldwide clinical trials across clinical operations, business development, and strategic commercial leadership roles. Ryan also has spent more than 15 years driving diversity and high priority initiatives for cross-functional organizations in academia, grassroots communities, and clinical research, including of CIS, CRP, ACRO, and WOCIP, Women of Color in Pharma. Thank you for joining us, Ryan. Our next panelist is Jay Graves. Jay is the founder and president of Pathfinder Business Consultants. He and his team help business leaders develop high-performance organizations through the power of diversity and inclusive leadership. Jay began his professional career as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army before transitioning to a career in healthcare sales as a senior executive. Growing up in an interracial family in the post-Jim Crow South, Jay uses his unique personal experiences with diversity, a proven methodology, and engaging storytelling to build successful DEI programs. Additionally, Jay is the host of the Diversity Breakthrough podcast series. We're excited to have you, Jay.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Our final panelist joining us today is Russell Jolivet. Russell was most recently the Senior Vice President of Talent Acquisition, focused on enterprise technology, digital, customer experience, data analytics, global banking operations, and marketing, HR, legal and inclusion areas for Truist, based in Atlanta, Georgia. Russell's career has been split between business and human capital. Earlier in his career, Russell focused on marketing, corporate finance and strategic planning, and management consulting. The second half of his career has been spent in human resources, talent acquisition, executive search, diversity recruiting, veterans recruiting, and college and MBA recruiting. Prior to SunTrust, now Truist, Russell led talent acquisition for a $5 billion private equity portfolio company, Assurion, in the technology, telecom, and services sectors. Russell is an avid international traveler and foodie, and he has visited more than 70 countries. We're happy to have you, Russell. And before we jump in, I'd like to say a few words. Since 2014, there have been 15 Black Americans killed by police, starting with Eric Gardner. And within the past 2 years, we lost Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Dante Wright, and Patrick Loyola. These individuals will never be forgotten. And throughout our session, we'll discuss how organizations can continue to raise the bar to scale their DEI programs across the workforce. Companies need to shift their DEI mindset by addressing this as a regular cadence. As executives and senior leaderships discuss DEI initiatives, the word initiative applies that it is temporary. DEI is very much a progressive practice that requires alignment across senior leadership, and many companies have dialed back their efforts up to this point. This is a reminder that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a marathon and not a sprint. You need to look for the small wins early on and to approach the roadmap logically. Without further ado, let's jump into our first question. How are organizations intentionally creating an inclusive workplace culture for all employees? Ryan, do you mind kicking us off?
Absolutely, Douglas, and thank you for highlighting just the poignancy of why it still matters even today. And what we're seeing is that folks are marching with their feet, right? So consumers are asking for organizations to really focus in on sustainability, wellness, technology, and the realness factor, right? Which diversity definitely is a component of that. And so with organizations who want to remain viable for not only today, but for tomorrow, it's really focusing on how can they authentically create an inclusive culture. And that takes intentionality from the most senior echelons of the organization, from the CEO down to the janitor, if you will. And so leading by example is probably the best proven way that we've seen time and time again from organizations such as IBM to Cisco and even my own. It's you got to walk the talk. You got to have that buy-in from the upper echelons in order for the cultural congruence to get sticky, where people really believe in the fact that the diversity makes sense, and more importantly that people feel like their voice is heard and they're respected and they're included at their company, so that way they can actually contribute and be very productive in their workforce.
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying, Ryan. And one of the things that I think companies who have done a good job of organizing, and I know we'll get into this I think a little bit later, like ERGs and tapping into their current diverse workforces, listening, taking time to listen to them and listen with open ears and be courageous as leaders to make the changes that need to be made. A lot of times I find that, this is sometimes where the fear factor comes in, of going through sort of the change curve of how are we going to shift our culture from here to here to make sure that it's more inclusive. And I always just say, let's talk to the employees. Let's hear what they have to say. What are the things that they want to see? Where are we lacking? And then it really just comes down to courage and making those decisions and making those choices and investing and making the change to ensure that you have an inclusive culture. Because the thing that you can't have is try to go after diversity if you don't have an inclusive culture. That's where you can actually do more damage than good, because you don't want to have diverse individuals coming into your organization and landing into what would be a toxic culture for them.
The only thing I would add to that is that once you do listen, just do it, make it happen, engage heavily.
And follow-up question for our panelists, with the idea of creating an inclusive workplace culture for all the employees, how can organizations better influence senior leadership to really focus on the importance of DEI today, and also in regards for long-term?
Well, I personally would start with, there's two pieces for me when I think about DEI. One is the right thing to do, and it's the right thing to do for people and your people strategy. But also too, some business leaders that I work with, they think maybe they're still in kind of a, well, let's just check the box kind of thing. There is a ton of data out there that shows that that diverse businesses outperform non-diverse businesses. And so, a lot of times what I've seen is sometimes it starts as grassroots and starts to put pressure on the upper echelons, as Ryan said. And so if you're in that type of situation, for those leaders, I would very much articulate that, number one, this is better for business. Number two, and Ryan, I'm going to steal your phrase again, people are voting with their feet, right? Like, people have choices. Companies that are doing this right, they're able to bring talent in, and they're sucking talent away from companies that aren't being intentional around this. But I would say, as a business leader, even if maybe you're not bought into, or you don't believe in just sort of the notion of social diversity, which, look, let's face it, some don't. Look at the business side of it. Do you want to be a competitive business or not? Because this is the way things are heading.
And if they don't address it, I mean, the population is growing so diverse that you're going to run out of customer base especially if you're a large company, if you don't get involved and engaged and make sure that you are addressing some of these business, just from the business perspective alone. I mean, you look at some of these diverse cities and you won't have anybody, your cells will shrink if you don't start addressing it.
Mm-hmm.
Because they will.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the multi-ethnic is a new majority, and that was proven in the last census as well. All those, the kiddos that are 18 and younger, they are now multi-ethnic is a majority. And to our other panelists' point, you know, if you want to remain sustainable and viable in business, it's important that you think holistically. More importantly, as well, you might uncover hidden market opportunities, right? But by having a more diverse leadership team, you might be able to problem solve in ways and find new innovations. So really, it's really it should be a part of any organization's playbook for corporate social responsibility and sustainability, more importantly, if you want to continue to stay innovative and competitive in today's marketplace, as the other panels have mentioned. And heck, just look at biology, right? You have to have a little heterogeneity, otherwise things become extinct.
Yeah, I have definitely, you know, there are definitely examples out there that we've probably seen where a company has completely missed the mark because they're not diverse and they're trying to reach out to a diverse audience. One that always kind of comes top of mind to me is back when Gap was trying to break into the African-American market, and but all their marketers were white. And so they reached out to LL Cool J, who was also a big supporter of FUBU, which stands for Us by Us, which is Damon John's black-owned business. And so they asked LL Cool J to come up with a jingle and come up with a commercial, and he did it. And at the end, he said "For Us by Us," and it went out there, and everybody thought it was great. And then somebody said, "You know, he's promoting another clothing line within the Gap clothing line." And nobody knew. Well, imagine if you would have had a diverse marketing team, or you had an influence internally, somebody probably would have picked up on that and said, "Hey, you know, we need to promote our product here." But you know, that's you know, there's so many examples of where companies have just missed the mark because they don't have diversity within their organization. Yet they're trying to reach out to this more and more diverse population of customers out there, and they can actually cause more harm than good.
Thanks, everyone. Let's move on to the next question. Where do you start in terms of building a DEI program? Jay, do you mind sharing your insights?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, this is something that we work with a lot of our customers here. And so I did want to share our maturity model. And at the top of this model, we always start with governance. A lot of times what we might run into is that there may or may not be a steering committee, or maybe there's the individual who's kind of been tapped to lead the diversity, you know, program within an organization. And so the first thing we do is we work on a formalized steering committee with very clear roles and responsibilities and decision-making authority within that group. And so we start with the governance piece of that. And during that process, at least for what we do, is we start off with with a charter, a purpose, a vision. You know, what is it that we want to accomplish? Set expectations that this is a journey. And then always for the next piece is you got to understand where your organization currently is. So that if you can establish that through surveys, through looking at your data, listening sessions with employees, listening sessions with customers, and kind of pulling all of that together in an assessment. And then based on that, you can take that information, you can take your vision, and probably the most critical step after that is coming up with your strategy or your road mapping. And this is critical because this is where you start to map out the activities, the different things that you need to do to realize your vision and to move the needle in your organization towards your goal. So after you do the strategy, then you're ready to engage the organization to start to implement that road mapping. I put development in here as well, because during this, you're talking about change management and a lot of this, and that's where we start to really hone in with like the leaders in the organization, the key influencers in the organization, and work on, organizational development. And then you have to measure your progress and, kind of see how you're doing on your roadmap, on your strategy, on your vision, and then adapt from there. And then the cycle continues, and it, that is just continuously run through your governance and your steering committee. And it's just an ongoing process improvement. It's ongoing listening, and it's just an ongoing journey.
Russell or Ryan, any additional context to share?
I think it's quite comprehensive.
Absolutely, but that baseline is crucial. And then more importantly as well is I would express that, I hope leaders would listen with a humble heart to the feedback because it can be very humbling what comes back. So be willing to challenge your own notions, i.e. the biases of what the data should be, but really take it in. And as Russell mentioned earlier, just do it. So
I will add one thing. One thing I thought was very powerful at one of my previous companies is kind of in the assessment stage is admitting that we're not where we should be, because so many people and or leaders like to deny that there's been either wrongdoing and or that there is an issue. And I think that goes a long way with your audience as to some level of sincerity and validity in wanting to achieve something better than where they are today. So humbling, as you mentioned earlier, Ryan, it's important.
Thanks, everyone. And a follow-up question for the group. For those organizations that do have a mature DEI program today, what advice can you share with the audience to help keep senior leadership highly engaged?
I like to make sure that we have senior leaders as sponsors of particular parts of the roadmap or parts of the strategy, particularly when you're talking about employee resource groups. That keeps them grounded. It keeps them, kind of with their sleeves rolled up in the day-to-day, and a pulse check on, that particular represented group within your organization. And again, for this model, at least, as an accountability partner, at some point, I kind of become more of an accountability partner when we've gotten to the mature stage of this. And it is to make sure that we are continuously coming back together as that governance team. And that there is that responsibility and accountability stays with that team, and that they are still sticking with the assignments that we've put towards that we put forward, when we were first starting the program. So I think, again, there's always that opportunity to make sure that we're keeping people connected, particularly the top, with the progress of the program.
And I think also sometimes things go unnoticed. So one of my previous companies, they actually put it in the annual report. All of the progress that had been made, whether it's in community giving, whether it's on the business side, on whatever side of aspect of their whole business, they highlighted it at the end of the year. And that gave people a sense of reward and just showed how much impact they could actually have. And it kind of energized people to continue to do it, and somewhat created some camaraderie between all of the different diverse groups, because they want to stand out. They want to make sure there is impact in what they are doing and giving back.
Absolutely. And what we're talking about is bigger than just diversity, right? What we're talking about is having an energized and engaged workforce. And studies have shown, recent data from Gallup, for example, was showing that engaged workers actually turn a 23% higher profit compared with business units and companies with miserable workers. And so really what we're trying to offer is food for thought on ways to keep the overall workforce engaged, energized, productive, and that way you can drive greater innovation for all the customers that we serve. Definitely having regular, consistent communication is key. So that way people don't lose sight of the fact that this is a journey. I love what Genentech recently published in conjunction with their CEO, as far as having a separate diversity report where they highlighted the diverse suppliers they were working with, the actual community impact to patients that were being served, and also the spend that they had committed to making sure that they were advancing the model. And so now it's keeping folks accountable because this report has now come out with all the benchmarking. And so now that you know where you are, you can keep going and keep iterating, because organizations are living, breathing entities.
Thanks, everyone. Let's move on to the next question. Russell, can you share some context on how you stay engaged with the community and the customer base?
Sure. Thanks, Doug. First of all, I think many companies and entities make a mistake by thinking one size fits all. And it doesn't necessarily, unless you have a very homogenous group, and we all know in the US and the world, there aren't too many places where there is that those homogenous societies. So it is very, very important for us to listen as leaders, as we engage. And once you listen, and to listen effectively, you've got to engage those people, your recipients, those people that are in your audience, that are going to buy your products, that are going to buy your services, and those teammates in your organization that will be recipients of this environment and culture in which they work. And once you do that, then you develop unique products and services that are tailored to and customized to your particular audience. And so many companies have done that and realized, wow, this is a whole group, an incremental amount of income that or revenue that I never even thought we could gain. And sometimes it's a small tweak. And then just repeat that. And you have to go all in. I've seen situations where, say, a credit card scenario, or even a loan scenario, you want to deal with the Hispanic community in an area where English is only a second language. And yeah, you have the advertising and of the program just on a flyer or whatever on your initial page in Spanish. But as you go through the process of processing loans, none of those documents are in Spanish. So you really have to work through details to keep people engaged. Otherwise they start falling off through the process and become very frustrated, on and on and on. So make sure they're involved throughout and test it before you go. And think of an old car company, a current car company that introduced a car in Spanish-speaking countries. In this particular scenario at the time where they ran into the issue was into Venezuela. Nova, which means Nova means no go in Spanish. And so who wants to buy a car that's named no go? So if you listen to the employees first, listen to the audience first, then that mistake would not have been made. Probably the greatest of intentions, but it costs them a lot of money. So listen is the key.
Yeah, listening and then acting with a culturally relevant approach. I mean, in the healthcare space, which I sit, some of the things that have come up, are definitely the marginalization of different communities, but also myths, right? That folks of color don't want to participate in certain studies or in trials, period. And, sometimes you have to peel the onion back. So for example, on a lupus trial, there was a lot of data that showed that actually, while the indication disproportionately impacts people and women of color, they had assumed that maybe these Hispanic and Black women and other women didn't want to participate. The reality of it was when they did the surveys, they found out that the office hour visits actually directly conflicted with their work hours. So if you're asking people to come into the doctor's office only between 9 to 4, and those are the exact times that they have to report in for their work, and then you add on the layer of who's going to watch my kids and all these other different barriers. It's not a matter of people not wanting to do things. If you actually take the time to listen and understand who it is that needs to be impacted, you can come up with the appropriate solutions. Maybe there are a few different flexible hours you can offer. Maybe it's the telemedicine, maybe it's a decentralized model where you can bring it to people in the comfort of their homes, or just meeting people where they are in a more robust way. And so, but that requires being engaged. That means, actually taking the time to listen. And lo and behold, a program actually ended up retaining and reflecting over 50% diversity when some of those measures were accounted for, and 90% retention. So it's just a matter of really following through and offering some different scenarios, and you never know what you might uncover.
If I were to comment on this, I would just highlight, for me, I mean, all this is amazing. It's that listening piece. I worked for a very large organization, Roche, which is actually part of Genentech, right? And I was fortunate enough to lead a marketing organization for a bit, and we were really kind of missing our mark with our division on our customer base. And so we started to really reach out to the population that we were serving. I was in our diabetes division, and diabetes is something that affects African American, Hispanic, Native American populations a lot higher than other populations, ethnic populations. And so we started doing listening sessions with that group. And Ryan, very similar to what you're talking about, we started to learn, as we were building services, as we were building things, people wanted to be really, really engaged. It's just that our solutions weren't built to meet them where they were. And so we were able to make a lot of strategic changes to make sure that we were doing what we could to meet the patient where they were at versus what our vision of that was, and then trying to shoehorn everybody into that. And then really thinking about the culture, of things, everything from cuisine to lifestyle to where you're located. We learned so much just by listening and getting groups together and having those listening sessions. And then it allowed us to, amplify our strategy and be successful.
And I'll circle back on the repeat piece as well, because you don't repeat the same thing necessarily. You have to continuously listen. It's sort of like human AI. Trends change over a period of time, and you've got to continuously change as time moves on, as your customer base evolves. And I'll give you an example of actually a friend of mine who's a physician, had regular office hours at one time, but then switched because his customer base were a lot of hourly workers, shift workers, and what have you. So having the 9 to 5, they can't just step out like we do professionally and run to the doctor without any issues. So what he did, he started appointments around 3 o'clock in the afternoon for those who were off during the day, and then they ran to like 10 p.m. at night. Mm-hmm. A very robust business. But how often do you ever get to go to the doctor's office at 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night? And maybe after you've gotten your kids in, and now you can go to the doctor and deal with it. Or even kids, they're in school. Don't take them out of school. They can go to the doctor's office at 8 o'clock at night after they finish their homework. That's right. So it was kind of unique. I had never heard of that. It wasn't even in my purview, but I thought that was a brilliant idea. And sometimes he holds weekend office hours as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, everyone. And from the context shared, it sounds like listening and acting is highly critical to demonstrating engagement to the community and the customer base as a whole. And as a friendly reminder, we do have a great panel with experienced DEI leaders here in their industries, so please don't hesitate to ask any questions. We will move on to our next question. So employee resource groups have become a powerful vehicle to leverage employee engagement, especially since the pandemic. According to McKinsey and leanin.org, 35% of companies have added or expanded their support of internal clusters. To have a successful DEI program, how much of a company's budget should be allocated to support the efforts to develop ERGs to leverage them to support the company's DEI goals? Jay, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. It's hard to answer the actual budget piece of things because companies of different size, the budget might be proportional to the size of the company or the size of the employee base of the organization. So, for a percentage, it's kind of hard to answer that. However, what I will say is that ERGs are the lifeblood of a successful diversity program. This is like all the things that we've been talking about here, the listening, the culture, influence of leadership. I mean, all of that is really propped up by having ERG groups. And so what I would say is that, with organizations I'm working with, the requests that are coming through, find the money. I don't know what percent of spend that is for that particular organization, but when you're talking about, opportunities for them to connect with the community, opportunities for them to grow personally and professionally, bringing speakers in, all of that, pales in comparison in the investment, request to what you're going to get out of that employee resource group. And, there's often an impact, not just with internally from an ERG, it's also with the community because they are networked into the community. So when you think about coming back to the business, hiring, those customer listening sessions, all of that, that's your pipeline, right? That's your pipeline to the community. And, you can also tie it back to the business as well. Some ERGs, there's a couple of different names for them. Some are called BRGs, business resource groups. And when you kind of look at the life cycle of a resource group, really kind of going from that ERG to that BRG is when they're very, very active in the business. And I actually have an example of this where I was part of the veterans ERG at Roche, and one of the divisions was really, really struggling in trying to work with the government and trying to get contracts with the government and trying to make progress with the government. And so they tapped into the veterans ERG and they said, here's our strategy. What are we doing wrong? And we immediately said, you're speaking a different language. You're coming at it a different lens. You don't really have the right people at the table. And so some of the members who were in sales and business development participated in the next few meetings, and the organization ended up winning that contract. So leveraging that ERG was a real powerful way to drive the business. But in addition to that, we flew the Roche banner when it came to marching with other groups and participating in Pride Month and other, supporting other ERGs, right? So, we became sort of this banner for the organization that brought a lot of pride internally with employees. It brought a lot of pride for the ERG and the community, and it drove business. So whatever that spend is that they're coming to you for, I would highly recommend that you consider it, because the ROI is absolutely there.
Great, thanks, Jay. And it looks like we have a question from the audience. How do you shift organizational culture from seeing DEI work as optional or fuzzy feeling work to being fundamental to the organization's success? We struggle to receive funding from the organization, and the sentiments often seem like the work we are trying to do is not important to the organization.
I think Jay hit on that, especially with the most recent example that he gave regarding, being able to leverage and tap into the veteran community, and that had a meaningful impact on the bottom line for the organization he was with. From my experience, it is taking it back, and sometimes, it is a little clinical an approach, but you have to look at the bottom line and say, can we really afford not to? Can we afford to not have an engaged workforce? And providing tangible examples within your industry, cross industry, where the numbers are there, the data supports it, of, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like. And then also, when we say diversity, it means a lot of different things depending on the region. So you got to think globally and holistically, but act locally. And I would challenge leaders in an organization to think of what are some small ways in which we can move the needle, and then try to capture those wins, and then make sure you communicate them back to the company. And, the more visibility it gets, the more communication around it. I know it's uncomfortable at times, but with the right champions, you can really make a difference and move the needle.
One of the things that I find sometimes frustrating is the data. We've been talking about the data for over a decade about, the power of a diverse organization when it comes to business. Yet, it's very similar to this, fuzzy feeling, right? People tend to push it off to the side as kind of like this nice to have, not a must have. And it is very quickly shifting to a must have if you want to run a viable business. And so, for me, it's, making sure they understand that business is going to demand it. I mean, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. I think Ryan hit on it. You got multicultural customers, is becoming the majority, right? So you're really, I think what I try to impress upon people is you're going to miss out on a competitive advantage by not investing in a sustainable and genuine DEI program. I see so many companies who are willing to throw tons of money at their business strategy. They have no problem calling in a large company like a McKinsey or something and spending a ton of money on their business strategy, and then eking out just a little bit of money here and there for their people strategy. And that is a massive, massive miss, because you can have the best strategy in the world, and if you don't have the right culture, the right people, and your people engaged, and you haven't invested in their growth, and as part of that growth and being a DEI program, then your strategy is only going to be so good. And so what I always recommend is, look at what you're willing to pay over here on the business strategy side without any hesitation. You should have the same feeling around sort of these fuzzy areas that you consider fuzzy, because that is going to drive your strategy that you're spending all this time and investing in.
Great, thanks, Jay. And follow-up question for our panelist. So for those companies that don't have ERGs and or BRGs set up today, can the group highlight a couple of approaches on how to address this with senior leadership and to highlight the benefits of having these ERGs and or BRGs set up?
I would go back to that model and just make sure that before you start pulling together and organizing ERGs, that there is support, that there is a steering committee in place to support the ERG. If you start, pulling ERGs together, as maybe part of a grassroots to energize maybe the top echelons or mobilize the group, that can be successful only to a certain point. What I typically see there when things start grassroots is they do start with those ERGs, and sometimes they are just a couple of people getting together and saying we're going to form this group, and we're going to take it as far as we can and make as much noise as we can, to get movement within the organization. Where that starts to fail is if nobody hears them, and then that's where you start to experience turnover, frustration, and sort of a toxic environment. So what I would say is if you have an organization that doesn't have an ERG yet, I would have several questions. One, do you have a steering committee? Have you started with your governance first? Do you have the right environment to even start an ERG? And then if you don't, let's start there. Let's kind of highlight that, and then you can build towards bringing those grassroots groups together, or as you're having listening sessions, kind of get a pulse for what ERGs you can form quickly. And then you can start to pull the ERGs together. And they're great to have, during this continuum. Usually in a lot of organizations, it'll be part of the strategy piece here where you start to build your ERGs out. But if you already have that grassroots going, involve them in your assessment, involve them in that early stages of kind of building this program. But I would definitely just be cognizant of making sure that they have the support and infrastructure that they need to be successful.
And I would say, going back to sponsorship, once they are in place, or even as you're starting them, the executives basically who report into the CEO should own one of the ERGs, and each one should have one. And that way they have a lot of power and influence in the organization, and it should be a part of their goals to be successful with these ERGs and whichever one they may be sponsoring. And once you do that, it gives them the go ahead and the leverage to always find the money, to always be there influencing and pushing and supporting and listening, so that it just keeps the momentum going. After we had those executive sponsors in my previous companies, there were pretty much no issues in getting funding and or getting people to participate, period. They set an example basically, and by their presence and their influence, it shows that the company is valuing it, and people step up. It also gives those people a chance to actually interact with an executive at that level that they otherwise would not get to do for the most part.
Yeah, but if you don't have that executive sponsorship, to my other panelists' points there, it could do a little bit more harm than good, because it can leave people feeling very discouraged. It can only grow to a certain extent. And when that handful of people either matriculate or leave the organization, then you're left at square one and ground zero. Whereas if you have that executive buy-in, you can iterate on it, you can build progress, you can maintain progress, and it does, it does a bit more good in trying to further and advance the holistic goals of the organization. But the ERGs can offer just a wealth of great informalized training and learning opportunities, and also direct connection to the community. But if the organization's not there yet, and I don't know if an ERG or a BRG is appropriate for every size organization just yet. Sometimes it's something that one can aspire to. I don't know if it's one where you need to feel so much pressure if you don't even have a diversity policy to then just run the gamut and just try to jump in starting ERGs, because you need to listen and do a benchmark to make sure you're starting the right ones at the right time and then scaling them and growing them. Otherwise, you could be missing the mark in a significant way.
And I think it also goes back to something Jay said earlier about having when he was introduced about storytelling. That tends to be less abrasive to people, but it sets such a great example, and it reaches into people's hearts basically. And then just because of that, people want to do something about it. And this happens to be one of the things that you put out there. Well, let's do BRGs. It's storytelling I think can be extremely powerful, even more so than sometimes than actually giving the statistical data and all of the research, because it's a bit less abrasive and it personalizes it.
Yeah, tug at the heart, right? And I think one thing too, just I have seen organizations where maybe at the C-suite, right, they've said, yeah, we believe in this, we're willing to cut the check, but maybe they're not quite ready to be a part of councils and things like that. I mean, even if you find yourself kind of stuck there, you often will find, depending on your kind of org structure, a director or a VP, like it doesn't have to be necessarily at the C-suite of your sponsor, or find that change agent that is that natural leader in an organization. Maybe they don't have the title, but they've got influence with the people in the organization that can make change. So it's key to have kind of those identified individuals to be that sponsor. And if you can't get that high up corporate sponsor, look for that change agent, look for somebody who has influence in the organization, maybe a little bit of authority, and you can continue to use that to help mobilize the rest of the group.
And it looks like we had a question come in from the audience. What about diversity councils? Are they effective if ERGs are part of the program?
So I guess my question would be, by diversity council, you mean the steering committee? Maybe if that's how I'm reading that, then for me, obviously, I'm very passionate about ERGs because they are the lifeblood. So if you have a diversity council, and again, Ryan, I think is spot on. Not all organizations are ready. I work with everything from small to enterprise companies, and some small companies, you're talking about 20 some people, right? Like you're not going to have, a bunch of ERGs, and in those, but you may have your diversity council, and maybe you have like a multicultural, subcommittee, or, a cultural committee, or things like that. Whatever kind of look and feel of that, either way, connecting into that community and organizing that community will help you support in your diversity and inclusion culture efforts.
Absolutely. And I think if you have that diversity council and not yet an ERG, laying out what the cultural calendar is, right? And how can you align that with different exciting initiatives and things that are actually happening within your business as well? And can you somehow marry the two together, where you are bringing out the best of the culture, bring out the best of folks, and also aligning your product in such a way that it really does capture the hearts and minds of the people that you wish to serve. And it's kind of like I love creating those win-win-win scenarios, right? I know Dale Carnegie spoke about it real well. Instead of the win-lose, right? Where in order for something to happen, someone's got to lose, but actually if you can align those things together. So, this month is Hispanic Heritage Month, right? And so if we look at the fact that September 15th, why it's so significant is it's an Independence Day for several various Latin American countries. And so is there a way that folks can connect with their Costa Rican customer base and employees, or Nicaraguan and others, in a meaningful way, in a fun way, that's genuine, right? Is the biggest piece too. So I'll pause there.
Great.
Pass it back.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Thanks, Ryan. And this is a good segue into our next question. What strategies can companies incorporate into their DEI programs that highlights inclusivity during Hispanic Heritage Month? Ryan, would you like to kick us off?
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, it's taking a pulse check, if at all possible, within your existing employees, right? Bringing awareness at your next all hands meeting to the contributions of the Hispanic and Latin community to folks in your sector and your business, and highlighting the great things that are occurring. I know within my organization, for example, we were really intentional about highlighting some of the Hispanic physicians that we were working with, and their contributions and what even inspired them. And it had a multi-pronged approach where not only did it energize patients to remain encouraged that actually they did have physicians that look and felt like them, but also from a talent perspective, right? Seeing that there were folks that we were collaborating with that were from that community. But I'd say do your best to be as genuine and authentic as possible, because people can read past it, and then making sure that you don't just lump everyone into one category. While it's not directly related to business, it was really cute in the most recent Father of the Bride, where they highlighted the various cultures, if you will. So they had the Mexican fiance with the Cuban fiance, and it was really good to highlight that while folks spoke Spanish, they had different cultural nuances that made their families unique. And so not to just try to group people into one large swath, but really take the time to notice the nuances that make us all so wonderful.
One of the things that I love about highlighting different groups each month is not the short-term kind of short view of celebrating them, but it's carrying that forward through the rest of your not even the rest of the year, but learning, hyper focused on that month, learning what it means, like what you shared, Ryan, like what is Hispanic Heritage Day about, right? Like, learning about the LGBTQ month, like it's not something that we celebrate just that month, right? It's something that we learn and then we can carry forward as part of our knowledge, personal knowledge base, right? And then that just helps expand us as empathetic, open-minded human beings that think about different people's experiences. So for me, that's the key to these types of events and types of months.
And I just think that people need to look at everything in a positive sense. It's a chance to learn. It does, and realize that differences can be good and advantageous and not a negative. So often we look at these things as a burden or a negative. And I think if you can change the mindset culturally to think of these things as positive attributes and enhancements to our knowledge base and the way we interact as people, I think it would enhance the workplace as well.
Great, thanks everyone. Looks like we had another question come in from the audience. And this is going back to the funding question. For a $2 billion business, what have you all seen as a budget for DEI? I have seen $2 million for a $50 billion enterprise. Anyone care to respond?
I'll give an example. And one organization that I'm familiar with, which is probably a $20 billion company, each group had about $125,000 budget on an annual basis. But this was kind of built based on, and you can do this with any company, so that amount is irrelevant until you think about some of the activities that you believe would be impactful. Once you do kind of a zero-based budgeting scenario, once you figure out those activities, whether it's guest speakers, as someone mentioned earlier, whether it's field trips to museums, whether it's social gatherings, whatever the case may be, or DEI training, it is all based on what it might cost to do some of these impactful things. And not that everything has to be done every year. And you can just decide what are the priorities and what activity is going to be done, and then build up to see what looks equitable at that point. And that could be $25,000 for a company per group. It could be $200,000 or $300,000 for a group. I can only imagine, like Jamie Dimon at I've never worked for this organization for JP Morgan, but he's very bold and very aggressive. They probably have very aggressive budgets. And you also have to consider where your organization is in the framework of wanting to be inclusive. In the beginning, it might be fewer things. As you grow and energize people and energize the management team, then those budgets may grow. So don't have in your mind that it has to be a certain amount year one.
Thanks, Russell. And this is a good segue into our last question. A recent LinkedIn poll by People Matters found that 21% of respondents have an ad hoc budget approval, and 22% of respondents shared that DEI is not a priority for their organization. With over 40% of respondents not having a dedicated budget, what message would you like to share with organizations that don't invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion monetarily? Russell, where should senior leadership focus their efforts?
Sure. I think there are four major components to this. So often we think of just talent acquisition when it comes to diversity, of getting people on board. Well, that's too narrow of a thought. I think you really have to be comprehensive in your approach, because otherwise people can interpret it as you're using me just to get your numbers going. It's at least on the talent acquisition side. So you do need to acquire talent from the outside. You also need to get involved in the community, because these people are going to see how you either address your community either in a wrong manner or not addressing them at all, where there is help needed. So how do you, through them, get back involved in the community and give back to the community? We all have a heart and we want to help people. Also, not only pulling people in from the outside through talent acquisition, but teammate development. There's so many diverse people in current organizations that are just kind of left behind because they do think and act differently. They come from different perspectives, and those perspectives aren't necessarily valued. It's a different thing and is negative. Well, why not take that and turn it into a positive and develop those individuals as well? And that way they become part of the organization. They feel like they're learning, they're gaining, they're progressing in the organization from a level perspective. And then last but not least, make sure there's a business component to the DEI programs as well, because that's where you can enhance your revenue stream as a possibility. And if you're comprehensive as such in an approach in all of these categories, you should be more effective in having impact, your company being impacted on a positive basis, whether it's productivity, whether it's revenue and profitability, and or the community in which you serve. And all of those things should just really make for a more profitable and great work environment for your people.
Yeah, there's a lot that could be done with meager budgets, right? So I don't want people to get disheartened either if they're thinking, well, my company by no means is going to make the investment. What could be done? Some of the things that can be done are drafting up the policies, right? Some of the things that can be low cost, high impact. Really, it's looking at mutual collaborations and partnerships, right? Not necessarily everything has to be in-house, but are there various community entities or various organizations in which you can collaborate with and come up with varying degrees of beneficial barters, if you will, to try to move the needle forward until you can generate some of the wins that will then garner additional investment and support, right? To work what you can. But I would say start with a really strong roadmap, start with your gap analysis, start with processes. And before you start building out a whole new DE&I program, I would also strongly suggest do some internal digging and look at an audit of existing processes. Are there various ways in which you could be more inclusive in the way things are asked or how they're presented to customers and client bases? Like, are there things that could be done to help improve work environments for diverse counterparts and colleagues? You know, some of the things that we're talking about are really a heart and a mind shift from leadership. It's not necessarily something that always has to be done with a checkbook. It's a mind book. It's a heart book, if you will. And if you could make some of those changes, the checks naturally follow.
I love that. There's a lot of, a quick Google search can find, diverse kind of supporting organizations a lot of times in your communities. They're looking for, they're not necessarily looking for money, they're looking for opportunities, particularly with a business. One of the things too that could be low hanging fruit for an organization is look at your supplier diversity. That, Ryan, to your point, it's free to sit there and look at your supplier diversity and come up with a policy, right? Maybe if you have ensured that you've done that gap analysis and you think, hey, I do have a great culture here, and you have an internship program, we'll face it towards like HBCUs or, certain groups, right? Or certain regions of the country where maybe a university has a higher group of that particular, ethnic mix, right? So, there are so many things that you can do that aren't high costs. I agree 100%. Love the comments here.
I mean, the community piece, if you're giving to a portfolio of companies, a portfolio of organizations, and, in that dollar amount, if you can't change it or increase it, just redistribute it as you assess. And it's like, gosh, we give money, but none to these diverse groups. So just shift it over time is a way to do it budget-wise without costing the company any additional money.
Great, thanks everyone. And we only have a few minutes left here. Any closing thoughts from the panel to share with our audience?
I might have to borrow Russell's tagline of, once you listen, just do it. No more excuses, no more, letting your fear get in the way. There are so many things that can be done with budget and without some budget. So I'd say get creative, get innovative, and remain passionate through the journey, because it is definitely a journey. This is not a one and done. So stay encouraged and keep moving forward.
You beat me to it, Ryan, because I was going to say the other day when we were talking, one of the things that I walked away with, Russell, was your comment, just do it. And so I don't have much more to add, Ryan. I think you articulated it perfectly. It is a journey. You'll have setbacks. You always have setbacks in a journey, and you'll have wonderful wins too. Stick with it, because it's so incredibly important. It's important for the community. It's important for your businesses. And it's well worth the journey. But yeah, I'm gonna have to piggyback and steal Russell's comment. Just do it.
I don't have any additional comments after that, but I do believe that in this world of with so much antagonistic hate and all that's going on, at least approach it in a positive manner, with the glass half full, and look at it in an opportunistic way. And going back to my comment about making sure that you are highlighting that the differences can be good versus here are all of the pains. Look at it from that stand, and maybe from that perspective, and maybe people will embrace it a bit more and just do it.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And I'd like to give a very special thank you to our panelists for a very informative and educational discussion. Feel free to scan their QR code to connect with them on LinkedIn. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for our past events, including the Halo series, where we feature thought leaders in a one-on-one setting as they discuss what is keeping them up at night. Again, thank you everyone for joining. Please keep an eye out for the survey request early next week. We will have a version uploaded to YouTube very soon, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you all.